Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Tax Day, Tuesday, April 15th, 2025. I'm John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
And social commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
Okay, so I don't know what to say. Everything is going haywire in all sorts of interesting and crazy ways. We're going to talk about Harvard. We're going to talk about the tariffs. We're going to talk about Iran. Just want to start quickly with the story of our the El Salvadoran prisoner currently in an El Salvadoran prison, who is an illegal immigrant from El Salvador to the United States, and who is now the focus of the highest level controversy in the United States. And the president of El Salvador was at the White House yesterday to discuss this matter in an exceedingly high-handed and fascinatingly high-handed fashion with our president. So the El Salvadoran immigrant in question, whose name, of course, I now can't bring to my mind, but anyone who wants to look it up can do so. This is a very strange case because he is in the country. He was in the United States illegally. About that, there is no question. He has been in the United States illegally since 2012, and he sought protection from deportation in 2019 by an immigration court on the grounds that he had a reasonable reason to fear that his life and freedom would be at risk were he to be returned to El Salvador, which is a condition allowing for some form of asylum in the United States, but not necessarily permanent asylum. And an immigration court judge found that he had a reasonable fear. So you might think, okay, well, the third branch of government, the judiciary, found this, and so this is now binding. Well, it is binding, but in fact, the immigration court that we are talking about is not part of the independent judiciary. It is, in fact, part of the Department of Justice. It is an arm of the executive branch of the federal government. So you could say, okay, well, the federal government, Department of Justice found this in 2019, changed its mind. Now it says he does not have a reasonable fear of persecution, or that it's not reasonable for him to remain here and he can be deported. However, no proceeding was entered into to make that argument. And in fact, as Andy McCarthy has said in a series of absolutely essential pieces on this and many other legal cases, at National Review, which had made him the indispensable analyst of our moment in talking about the complexities of the laws that Trump is trying to challenge or get around, because it was in power. The first Trump administration was in power in 2019 when this judge under its aegis found this, and it did not contest the judge's finding, nor did it contest any finding when it remanded him or took him and put him on the plane and sent him to El Salvador. So you could make the argument that as he is an illegal immigrant, it was found that there was one country and one country alone on the face of the earth to which he could not be deported, and that was El Salvador, even though he is a citizen of El Salvador. I don't know where you deport somebody to who is not a citizen of another country, of the country that's where we'd ordinarily deport somebody to. So you'd have to get that country to agree to take him. But we did get El Salvador to agree to take him because it turns out we're paying El Salvador $6 million to house the 200 plus people who went on that plane to go to the El Salvadoran prison. We're actually paying El Salvador to house them. And so in theory, we could say, well, that sliver of the $6 million that was supposed to pay for this guy, well, we'll refund you. You keep the money. We got to take him back. The Supreme Court said in its finding that the administration had to facilitate his return to the United States. And now, welcome those of us who have been celebrating Passover and had two seders, or one if you're Israeli, seders the other nights. Welcome to the Talmudic reasoning that you get to experience during some passages of the Seder that try to explicate how it is that the rabbis thought about things. Because now we have this giant debate over what the meaning of the word facilitate is. And the Supreme Court really should know better. Like, it should speak more clearly. Obviously, maybe this was a negotiation to get just to the word facilitate. But they've left open this giant hole in which the administration says now saying, well, we will facilitate it. We've got a plane. That just means we have to have a plane ready to bring them home, bring them back to the United States. But we can't make the Salvadorans release him from prison. It's their prison. And he's a Salvadoran. He's a Salvadoran. We don't have rights over him. He's an illegal immigrant to the United States. They want to keep him in prison. What sovereign right do we have to challenge their sovereign relationship with their own citizen? Which is, as I say, a very Talmudic way, both the word facilitate and this thing, which is, look, he's a Salvadoran. We got no, whatever you would call it. We have no extraterritorial access to him once we put him on El Salvadoran soil. That seems to be an incredibly disingenuous argument. Bukele, the president, wants to be a friend of Trump's. If Trump said, hey, send him back, I'm sure he would do so. He says, no, terrorists should be in jail. That's what he said to Trump. Trump said, you know what, you're so great. Maybe you could build more prisons and we can actually send Americans, native-born Americans, to be in your prisons because they stink. And then he yelled at Caitlin Collins of CNN and said, when she asked him about this, why aren't you telling me I'm so wonderful because I'm getting criminals off the streets? Why aren't you saying, isn't that great? Your network is failing. You suck. All of that. So I'm now going to just state this plainly. This is not good. This is not good for the rule of law. It is not good for the good working order of the federal government to have the executive branch of the United States, in the person of the president and his deputy chief of staff, Stephen Miller, playing linguistic games with the courts, whose findings are, I think, pretty basic, which is he needed due process. You didn't give him any. He had actually already had some form of due process that found that he had a right not to be returned to El Salvador specifically. You didn't challenge it when it happened, and you were president then. You didn't challenge it before you put him on the plane in error. Then the lawyer in the courtroom said it was an error that he was put on the plane. Then she was fired by the Justice Department for having said this. Okay, I'm doing this whole long summary because it's bad, and anybody who thinks it's not bad is wrong. It's bad. This is really bad. And it starts getting to this question of, are we a nation of laws or a nation of men? If we're a nation of men, then whatever Trump does is fine for the people who like Trump. But we're a nation of laws, and we have a process, and the process was followed, and something happened, and the process was not, no one entered into a process to reverse what the process had found. And here we are.
It's transgress, or it's violative of of proper procedure, and it's bumbling, like it's which is a sort of real banana republic kind of combo, doing everything wrong and insisting on having it your way anyway, and covering and aren't I so great? It's getting very ugly. I think. I mean, that was the sort of feeling that I got in our 3 days off. It's kind of a circling the drain aspect suddenly.
Well, it also undermines what I think was one of the more powerful messages Trump ran and won this recent election on, which is the process was absolutely upended under the Biden administration. They let anyone in. They didn't vet. They didn't track them once they were in. It was anything goes at the border. And the American public said no to that. And they elected Trump to restore the process, to make sure that we had a border that actually vetted people, that didn't allow just anyone in, that wasn't secretly flying migrants around the country to make sure that everyone at the southern border didn't have footage of showing all these people, and then kept track of them and made them appear at their later hearings, and then they went through the process. That's what he ran on. This is such a stunning example of him allowing his ego and his unwillingness to admit error, and doubling down over and over again on that unwillingness, and allowing someone who's clearly a little bit unhinged in Stephen Miller to run up to the microphone and just start spouting nonsense. That's not process. And that's what he was elected to do at the border. So there's that. There's also the fact that he looks a little weak saying he can't get this guy back. He just got a Russian-American ballerina back. He's constantly boasting about how when he negotiates with people who are holding Americans, I know this guy is not an American, it's a different situation, but his whole shtick is, I can talk to anyone and make a deal and get what I want. Well, so he either needs to acknowledge he doesn't want this guy back, which, as John says, is flouting what the court has said, or he should get the guy back, put him through the process, and he can ship him back again. But at least he will have done what he promised the American people he was elected to do.
Yeah, it's very much, it's sort of literally the, for my friends, anything, for my enemies, the law, right? Because it's like, well, I can't force them to do this. There's a system in place. And it's like, well, you've returned 9 people from that El Salvador prison already. So let's stop. Make it a 10th, and make the minion of people you've had returned. But like, stop claiming you can't. We're literally watching you return people from there to our soil, and then But also, I would love it. First of all, I would love it if my Google News feed was stopped filling up with Maryland man headlines. Okay, I would personally.
You're a Maryland man.
I'm a Maryland
Seth
man.
Mandel is a Maryland man. This guy is an illegal immigrant living who is residing in Maryland. Yes.
And it's always Maryland man or Maryland father. It's never the guy. The guy's name, will be known. Garcia.
If we could remember it. If we could remember it. Yeah.
But then the other thing is that I think that there's a real serious chance that Trump is poisoning the other aspects of his immigration crackdown, right? It's going to be harder to defend some of the visa revocations or things like that of pro-Hamas students. People are going to feel less inclined to put themselves out there to defend Trump doing that, even though they know intellectually that he has the right to revoke student visas, and that this is.
I don't think they do know that. I don't think they know that, and I think as we're having this kind of earnest conversation, he may be more politically right here than we are, or than Andy McCarthy is, or than the sort of liberal consensus on how he's a monster who is, this is the University of Heidelberg in 1937 believers, which is to say, got this guy, he's saying he's a terrorist. They're saying, well, his lawyer says, no, he's not. Okay, but that's his lawyer, so his lawyer could say whatever he wants. Then people say, well, he hasn't been charged with anything. And then they're saying, well, that doesn't mean he's not a terrorist. The El Salvadorans say he's a terrorist. We're saying he's a terrorist. He's part of this gang. He's a gang member. Then people would say, why wasn't he charged? And the truth is, as we know, the American people largely do not care about the niceties of stuff like this. If they think he's a bad guy and he's in jail, that's fine with them. And that Trump has been thrown, into the briar patch here, where he gets to say, I'm trying to protect America from this guy. And courts can say that we should facilitate it, and Bukele doesn't want to put him on the plane back. So I would put him on the plane back, but he doesn't want to. And you know why? Because he's a bad guy. And it's better that he's not here than that he's here. And so we'll dot I's and cross T's if the court is making us do. But you know what? The outcome here is good, not bad. And I don't know that he has the worst of that argument about this guy or this case. That's why sometimes horror story cases, when liberals think that they've nailed Trump dead to rights on how the American people really feel about things like due process and all that, they don't care. Nobody cares about due process until they're the ones who get caught in the thicket, which is one of the reasons why we have due process rules as I said last week, which is they're unpopular for a reason, which is that the passions are served better by we're throwing the book at somebody. And if you don't like this, we'll throw the book at them with that, and they're bad and they're harmful to you. And we do need to care about it because people do get crosswise of due process all the time, and they need this relatively unpopular common law tradition dating back 800 years because it's one of the ways that tyranny is prevented from coming to power in a nation of laws.
Well, but this is why
yeah.
But that cavalier remark he made, I think to Seth's point, the cavalier remark he made about, oh, well, maybe I can outsource some American prisoners to you too. The one thing we still want to export, I guess, is, our prison population. And the people who fund.
Oh, we want to export prisons. A lot of stuff. We just, yeah.
I guess. Yeah. But that's actually where I think Seth is right to point out he could be undermining even people who support his extremely tough approach to immigration. Look, this guy broke the law by coming to this country. He did. I mean, I have no problem with him being deported. I do have a problem with the fact that the president has chosen this case to flout the Supreme Court's directive, other courts' directive, and not given this guy the one thing he's allowed to do. And we do know from the past that if you send me back to my country of origin, I will be, my life will be at risk. That has been abused in the process for many, many years. People are coached by NGOs and others on how to, gin up claims of political repression that actually they're here as economic refugees. So I have skepticism about that too. But when the president of the United States jokes in the Oval Office that it would be great to take our prison population and illegally ship them to another country to be held, that's not funny. And the interesting thing to me is I'm just as full of contempt for the liberal tears about Bukala and him sitting down in the Oval Office with this guy and them saying, look at the fellow authoritarians, et cetera, et cetera. The Biden administration sent a delegation to that guy's inauguration. It's not as if the Democrats have been, consistent across the board. He was useful to them when the trouble at the border really got bad. And that's when the Democrats changed their tune on Bukala. So I think there's a lot of hypocrisy on the side of the media and the Democratic Party about this guy. But it's not funny to joke about shipping American citizens to a foreign prison. That's not funny. No, who likes that? I mean, there must be some group.
I think some people like it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people like it.
I mean, because because Trump, when he talked about it, he filled it out with color, right? He said,
"Oh, he was excited." Yes, clearly.
I'm telling you, if you rape an 89-year-old woman or whatever, all his examples, if you I'm talking about someone who hits someone in the an old woman in the head, rape. It's like he's sort of coming up with these like death wish. Charles Bronson death wish sort of like thug scenarios about how he's going to send them. And I think that's he's kind of whetting an appetite there, for revenge.
Right.
And I think something else that's happening here is that, the part of the backlash against wokeism, longstanding belief in important American norms has gotten folded into like the idea of woke among the populists. It's like, oh, if you believe that, that's just like, that's all woke nonsense that you're talking about, like they make no distinction between good American ideals that preserve the good working order and the crazy stuff,
because those processes were in fact weaponized against people.
That's right.
By the left for many years, and Trump most notoriously. So I mean, you're absolutely right, and I understand their motivation. But to John's earlier point, we have due process because at some point you might be the one trapped in the Kafka-like mousetrap of this system where you cannot appeal, you cannot escape, and you have no idea why you're there and how to get out.
Right, and I think that there's wokeness is sentimentality to them. They are there's a large group of them that are just anti-sentimentality. Oh, boo-hoo, nobody's calling you by your preferred pronouns. Oh, boo-hoo, you didn't get due process and you sent to an El Salvadoran prison. That's how they all got folded in. Like, this is the real world. Welcome to the NFL. And it's the very idea of compassion and sentimentality
Right.
that gets trod under.
Listen, I am very compelled by the fact that people whom I know would prefer to be supportive of this administration, Andy McCarthy being one, Edward Whalen, Christine's former colleague at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, a legal scholar, former Supreme Court clerk, being another. I know people who would otherwise very much like to be supportive of the Trump administration's efforts, particularly on woke and in restraining the legal Black Lives Matter, critical legal studies world, are horrified by what they're seeing. They would prefer not to be. I think they would prefer to be able to come to an interpretation of the administration's behavior in these courtrooms that was more kindly disposed. And they're not. And that is very haunting to me, because when it comes down to it, you trust people whom you trust. And Andy McCarthy is somebody who has spent 30 years arguing, for example, that we allowed the legal system to become the means by which we tried to fight international terrorism, and made a huge mistake that by pretending in the 1990s, and he was the person who prosecuted the blind sheikh who was behind the first Trade Center bombing in 1993, and came to the conclusion.
Book on that, his book that he wrote on that, was what propelled him into this situation where he was a reliable commentator, a much sought after commentator on the legal specifics of all this stuff.
But his point was, we shouldn't have been in that courtroom altogether. This is a matter for American foreign policy and military policy to handle. These are not things that should be part of the American system. Like, this is stuff that's coming from the outside. It needs to be stopped from the outside. So it's not as though he is, somebody who's like, everything needs to go through the court. Everything should be adjudicated by the courts. But this is a different matter, and he's a sophisticated legal thinker, as is Ed, and so they are watching this with the color draining from their faces about what this portends in that Andrew Jackson way, right? Which is the Supreme Court, when Andrew Jackson said, Justice Marshall, says that what I did is wrong, let's see him enforce it. Trump has said he will obey the Supreme Court's dictates. He does not say he will obey lower courts' dictates, although, see, that's an interesting wrinkle in and of itself, because if the Supreme Court does not take a case that is presented to it, it is implicitly saying we accept the lower court's behavior. The lower court's conduct or ruling is binding on the United States and can be used as a precedent. In other cases, we don't have to say yes or no to everything. If we don't take a case, that means the case stands. Trump seems to be creating a predicate in which he says, the only court I'm going to listen to are the 9 justices in Washington, which, as I say, you kind of have, you are anyway. If you say, okay, well, an appeals court found X, Y, or Z, I guess we have to follow that dictate. Let's talk about him as a negotiator, since he was in the Oval with Christine's pronouncing it Bukala. I sort of thought it was Bukele. I don't know.
I thought it was Bukele. I don't know.
Bukele, whatever. I don't know. Anyway, so he's in there, and as I say, if we said, hey, send him back,
it rhymes with
should
ukulele.
Be okay. There you go. Okay. Somehow, does it? Does it say that? Oh, no. I don't know. Maybe you just looked it up. Anyway, okay. So he's not getting him out. So we can either presume he's a great negotiator, so that means he doesn't want him out, or he's not such a great negotiator. He doesn't want him out. So this is not the negotiating thing. Let's just talk about the negotiating that is going on, because for a great negotiator, he stinks on ice. He's such a great negotiator that he stinks on ice. Let's talk about the 3 major negotiations, or 4 major negotiations, that he is involved with right now. One is on the tariffs. So how does he stink on ice? He imposes retaliatory tariffs and then suspends them on the products that arguably deserve retaliatory tariffs. in order to make sure that we don't go into recession, right? Or to try to fight against a recession. That is high-tech electronics coming from China, right? The iPhone, flat screens, whatever. As many people have said, what goes on here when you impose tariffs and then you pull them back one by one is you are encouraging a form of extreme corruption called rent seeking, under which what you have is individual companies, corporations, capitalists courting him personally, trying to get a benefit for themselves that others do not get, right? So in a system of laws, if you impose a 10% tariff across the board, at least nobody is getting a better deal than anybody else. It's a flat thing everywhere. But if you say, okay, we're going to have 125% tariffs on China except for these goods, then it's like, well, what if I came to you and did your toenails? Would you maybe drop my tariff by 20, 25% or 30%? Or if I don't know, gave, as somebody suggested the other day, because Trump is, there's this, various things are before the antitrust or regulatory frameworks in the entertainment industry, maybe if you gave Donald Trump Jr. a fishing show on your cable channel, maybe the approval of your merger would go a little better. Could be a good, that's an emolument. It's unconstitutional. It's impeachable. As is any kind of rent seeking where you could prove that rent seeking took place. So that's the tariff negotiation. And then we have the 3 foreign policy negotiations.
We just add that the exceptions he's making also keep the markets in tumult. It leaves a lot of uncertainty.
Well, the markets did well yesterday. So, right. So he got the market to go up 300 points yesterday. So, because he announced it on Friday.
Uncertainty
so
remains.
We'll see what happens today. Right. Uncertainty is permanent in a situation in which you could somehow get him to let your tariff off or lower your tariff. Like there's no such thing as anything that is not uncertain.
Yeah, but companies cannot plan their supply chain shifts based on tariffs if they don't know if they're going to get. I mean, that's the uncertain. Like the planning for the manufacturers, the planning for the products that Americans rely on.
Right. So 3 foreign policy negotiations going on right now. One over the hostages in Gaza and possible ceasefire. Ukraine, Russia, and Iran. And as far as I can tell, he is stinking on ice on all 3 of them, and we should go through them. Eli Lake has a very good piece at the Free Press this morning, in which he says if you examine what the administration and what Steve Witkoff, the chief negotiator, are saying about Iran and about the deal with Iran, they are defaulting to the language of the Obama JCPOA that Trump said was the worst deal ever struck, right? Trump said it was the worst deal in the history of deals. And what is the language? The language is Obama said you can't have a nuclear weapon for 12 years. You can have a nuclear program. We'll give you we'll release $150 billion and we'll send it on pallets and on a boat in cash to you. Can't have a nuclear weapon. And the argument against this is the issue is not having a nuclear weapon. The issue is the nuclear program, which can refine uranium to a point at which if you have warheads, you can put them on the warheads in a week. You can break out of the deal, have a breakout, have a nuclear, then you're supposed to not have a nuclear weapon, but you could make one anyway. And then it's just like on faith that you're not going to do it. And that's why it was a bad deal, among many other reasons why it was a bad deal. So what we are supposed to be going after is the nuclear program. We are saying to Iran, no nuclear program. You cannot have a nuclear program. Don't give us this nonsense about how you want peaceful nukes. You have a lot of cheap oil on the ground. It doesn't make sense for you to build nuclear power plants to generate electricity. Don't give us that nonsense. No nuclear program, and we'll see what we can do to make your life a little easier and release sanctions on you and all of that. And what happened this weekend is that both Witkoff and Trump stopped saying program and started saying weapon. They can't have a weapon. no weapon. And Steve Witkoff went on TV and said, what we're looking for is to get the Iranians to agree to process uranium to 3%. The breakout is 80%. It's a whole, I'm not going to go into the percentages, but to go back to the Obama number in 2015, which is what level of refined uranium should be permissible. And that is Trump becoming Obama and Kerry. That's what's happening right now. Somebody
right. and that's the the other language they use is Steve Witkoff uses terms like need. They don't need uranium enriched past 3.67%. They don't need. And this was part of the big problem with the Obama crew and everybody who wanted to deal with Iran, because it treats Iran as a good faith actor. Well, if they don't need past this point, so let's all be reasonable. But nobody in Iran cares what they, nothing, none of this is about what an oil nation needs, nuclear power for any purpose, a nuclear weapon, a military purpose or civilian purpose. They actually don't need it for anything. But it's the need part that's, they don't need, it's like in America when we debate guns and somebody say, well, nobody needs a military style assault rifle or something. Like nobody needs this to hunt deer or something like that. This is what they're doing with Iran, which is a way of saying the program itself is fine and the existence of the program is fine, which is what worried everybody that would cause a nuclear arms race, a cascade in the Middle East, is that if Iran's program, not a weapon, but just the program was legitimized, then the idea of a nuclear program is legitimized. That is a change in the way that we have fought nuclear proliferation around the world. We have said, no, you can't have that stuff. And we've had countries dismantle their nukes. We had, AQ Khan. Which
country disbanded its nukes?
Libya.
Ukraine,
yes.
Yeah.
At
Ukraine.
our direction,
right.
And with the idea that they would do so if we made sure that Russia didn't swallow them, which is where we have to move in our conversation now,
right,
to Ukraine. So let's talk about Ukraine. So Trump was getting into the war on the first day.
It evidently started a war with, I learned this from our president and his, vast grasp of history.
Yes.
That was an appalling thing to say for him to say.
Yes. So he said over the weekend, after Russia bombed churchgoers going for Palm Sunday, 31 kids killed, and he said it was terrible. He said, oh, this is terrible. Our hearts go out. It's terrible. And then he blamed Zelensky.
Well, he said that's why you don't start a war. Yeah.
Yeah, he said, this is not my war. This is Biden's war. And all Zelensky does is come and ask us for missiles. And you don't go start a war with a country 20 times your size. First of all, it's not 20 times their size. It's a quarter of Russia's size in population terms. It's not 20 times its size, nor as the fact that Ukraine has battled Russia to this crazy draw is it 20 times weaker than Russia, as it turns out. So even that notion is pretty staggering. But that he should default after watching an atrocity to you brought it on yourself. You should just have let Russia swallow you up. This is where we've come. We're not even 90 days into this administration. So, if he'd ended the war on the first day, ended the war on the first day, thousands of Ukrainians have died since he started getting his fingers involved and Witkoff involved and whoever involved in negotiating with Putin, who has looked at the United States' behavior and said, I guess what I really need to do is get really brutal, really fast, as brutal as I can possibly be, because maybe he will get Zelensky to say uncle, and so I need to be in the strongest possible position to take as much as I possibly can in the deal at the time. Abe, what's you as a not all that distantly recent a visitor to Ukraine?
I think it's a combination of Putin thinking in the way you just described, and also thinking, well, let's act now, while the U.S. is also putting pressure on Ukraine and intermittently denying them intelligence and aid. He's made things so much worse. I mean, it's gone horribly wrong in terms of his supposed ceasefire there or peace plan. Putin's not budging. See, I think there's a slight difference with the Iran negotiations and the Russia-Ukraine negotiations from Trump's standpoint, which is that I agree on Russia, Ukraine, Trump as a deal maker, as a negotiator, stinks on ice. I think he could get what he wants, apparently, from the Iran deal. If he's when you start talking in terms that Iran could pretend to accept, you could get them to pretend to accept it, which I'm beginning to think would be just fine for him.
Right. Well, okay. So to be fair on Iran, just to backtrack, he also said yesterday, I feel like they're playing. They're playing us. They might be playing us. They're not really serious about negotiating. And, there's a lot of trouble at the end of that if they don't do what we want. And he said last week, we'll stand behind the Israelis if the Israelis want to go with them, which isn't really an answer because Israel can't really be the destroyer of the Iranian nuclear program. As far as we know, the capability really does reside with the United States. So if you really wanted to do that, the United States should be the lead actor, but nonetheless, he is talking more belligerently. The belligerence in the Ukraine-Russia case is all toward Zelensky, who is not the belligerent in this war.
But see, that's
Ukraine did not invade Russia. Ukraine did not invade Russia. Ukraine did not invade Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine. That's called yes.
Yeah, but this is why he does that. This is why he just factually says whatever the reason he can lie to the world and say that they were the aggressor is because, and I had a debate with a friend about this over the weekend. It was kind of fascinating to me. I was being persuaded. He was trying to persuade me that, again, there's this long-term strategy of, geopolitical shifts that Trump is undertaking, and we need to give him time and see how everything plays out. And I actually think that's a legit, you can make that case for any president who comes in and wants to shake up his foreign policy perspective. The problem is, though, American presidents used to speak of the world in such a way that the end goal was, is the world a safer place? And is it in particular a safer place to be an American and to do the things that Americans want to do? And Trump does not talk about that at all. He talks about making the best deal, beating this guy back. I'm smarter than him. I'm more powerful than him. They've been taking advantage of us, and so we're going to knock them back, even if they're our allies. That's not the way we have come to understand the end goal. So this is why I think we have a lot of doubt about whether there is any strategy here, because what is the end goal here? America wins. Well, what does winning look like? I still don't know what winning looks like to the Trump administration with regard to our position in the world. That's where I am at. I don't know if perhaps I'm missing something. Could be.
I just want to add to what you're both saying. Not only is Trump constantly blaming Zelensky, but his harping on Biden sort of causing this as well. And I have all sorts of problems, I think is well known with the Biden administration's approach to Ukraine. But this is like, a double music to Putin's ears. You have the American president constantly blaming Ukraine and the U.S. for this war. It's bad.
Right. The administration's position, and this is where we get to the nation of laws, not men problem, is he came in on the 20th of January, 2025, and it was year zero. French Revolution, it's year zero, right? What happened before is not to be taken into account. He didn't do it, wasn't his Justice Department, weren't his laws. Now that's what's interesting, by the way, about the El Salvadoran
Except for
illegal
the 4
immigrant
years
case
he was president before, by the way.
Well, no, but that's what I wanted to mention is in the case of the binding ruling of the immigration court in the case of the El Salvadoran illegal immigrant, that happened during his presidency and not Biden's. So if they really were gonna that's on him. Like that's on his Justice Department that they didn't say no. Sorry, that's a bad ruling. We're gonna revisit it or do whatever it is that you do procedurally to overtake it. Okay, but it's year zero, and so what he says when he doesn't like laws or he doesn't like findings or something like that is, well, I didn't do that. Biden. This was Biden's war. There's a new sheriff in town. So I'm going to suspend all grants to this, or I'm canceling these contracts. And you can't just cancel a contract. That's what a contract is. Legally, if the federal government has made a contract with someone, it's no different from I'm making a contract with you, Christy. You're going to buy, I'm selling you something and you give me money, and then I still have to give you what you gave me money for, binding contract, and you can take me to court for violating it. I am thrilled with many of the things that are going on in relation to the college campuses, but the Doge-led cancellation of existing contracts that are legally binding using emergency authority is, again, only justifiable if what you think is that the laws that preceded Donald Trump's coming to power on January 20th, 2025 are not binding on him.
And we should add, by the way, that in some cases,
yes,
in some cases, the USAID cancellations are for work that was done, and the Trump administration went to court to stop from having to pay for work that was already done.
Right. Okay. And, so what we are being asked to believe by MAGA people or apologists for him is that this is a legitimate way of dealing with, because we're in an emergency, he can use emergency powers to do emergency things like suspend things. Now, he ultimately, by the way, in war, we suspend habeas corpus. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. Franklin D. Roosevelt suspended habeas corpus. Notoriously, Edmund Wilson wrote a whole book about how Lincoln was the proto-fascist because he suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. Like, this is a long-standing argument. So he is now suspending pre-existing contracts, saying he doesn't want to have to pay them or we shouldn't pay them. This should be scaring I don't care how revolutionary, I don't care how radical you are. Everybody should be scared of this. This is not the way that you run you cannot run a civil society if the person who is managing the government decides what preceding binding authorities on him he is going to accept or not accept. And as Christine said, we already saw the deleterious consequences of this in the behavior of the Biden administration on illegal immigration. There are laws, there are rules, there are regulations, there are things. And they simply flouted them, or they did all of their own emergency stuff during COVID and Black Lives Matter and all of that, and the nation reared in horror. And weirdly enough, as I think is true, as Christine said, kind of elected Trump to stop the Biden lawlessness that wokeism represented. And now he's introducing rather than saying, okay, I'm not going to be lawless, he's like, well, he got to be lawless. I'm going to be lawless in my own way to
Well,
pursue my own aims.
let me make an argument for what I think the Trump administration is trying to do on campuses, and in particular with places like Harvard, the elite campuses, which are that's the big game. They want to bag those heads and put them on the wall. Perhaps on Donnie Jr.'s fishing show, which should involve some sort of reference to Fredo out in the boat in the lake, but that's another thing. I think that he is. The way that you use the regulatory state to enforce rules on campuses and Obama was a genius at doing this and harassing campus administrators with this, is you use the Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Education. They go in there, they send them firm letters, dear colleague letters. They basically threaten to revoke their funding and then get them to concede. They negotiate in the way that Trump is doing with tariffs, actually. But that's a very long and slow process. It very much gets overturned anytime a new administration comes in, and it's hard to make it stick because you can just upend it the next time a new president comes in. What he's doing is instead saying, I'm taking your money, and now you have to negotiate with me. And so he's skipping over that bureaucratic step. Part of me sort of thinks it's genius. Part of me is somewhat horrified because, as you say, if this leads to contracts not being fulfilled that were negotiated before, that is going to undermine the rule of law. But this is a purely political game. This really has nothing to do with. I know they're using the cover of the anti-Semitism task force, but I do think they're using that as political cover. If it does lead to universities being better about anti-Semitism on campus, that's all for the good. But this is pure brawling politics, and it'll be interesting to see now that Harvard has said no, while Columbia and others have negotiated, whether there are legal means for these universities to take the administration to court and fight it. But I think that's what they want to do. Right. They want to bag Harvard. They want to make sure that they're not getting taxpayer money while doing all kinds of crazy stuff with their teaching. And so they just reverse the equation. So we'll see if it works.
Well, the Harvard case is a good example of this, because Harvard settled a lawsuit with Jewish students a couple months ago. We wrote about it. And in that settlement, and this caused a ruckus on campus, in that settlement, Harvard agreed to use the IRA, as we call it, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. I think it's the last word, but IHRA.
IHRA definition of anti-Semitism.
But it's it's essentially the consensus definition of anti-Semitism among the Jewish world, and it is
the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance.
The A was alliance. The A was always the least important one to remember. Yes. I remembered International Holocaust Remembrance. That's the point.
Yes.
But Harvard agreed to use this definition, to incorporate this definition into its guides, in student behavioral guides, which essentially refers to harassment. So the harassment guidelines on campus at Harvard will be using this as a guide. And this definition is much harsher on anti-Zionism. It doesn't let anti-Zionism so easily slip through. It doesn't let anti-Semitism slip through under the cover of just anti-Zionism. And Harvard there was an outcry at Harvard because people wrongly said, some organizations that FIRE and other organizations that ought to know better sort of freaked out and said, well, now you're going to be punished for criticizing the Israeli government, when in fact the IHRA definition only says that certain criticisms of Israel can be motivated by anti-Semitism and can reveal anti-Semitic motivations for actions that are taken. But Harvard essentially took a hit from the left, is what I'm saying, for this. Now, the Trump administration, if I were them, I would have studied that and said, and in fact, when I wrote about it and we spoke to the attorneys and the people involved, they said, look, we want this to be something of a prototype for the government also, when the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, when they reach agreements with schools, we want the settlements to look something like this, which is meaningful, some meaningful action that Jewish students are asking specifically for. The demands that the Trump administration has made of Harvard go farther than the demands they have made of Columbia. Now, Columbia had agreed to the demands, but then had started monkeying around and saying, and doing the, talking
We're
out of both
not going
sides
to
of their
enforce
mouth.
them. Yeah.
Yeah, and saying to their faculty, "Don't worry, don't worry." So the Trump administration said, I think reasonably said, well, we need to establish whether you're actually going to follow them or not before you get the funding back. But in Harvard's case, they went into an intellectual diversity issue and want to sort of dive into different programs.
We should explain this. So the target, the way that you go with the funding is Title VI, right? That is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which is separate discrimination enforcement separately. And the idea was Jewish students were being harassed, being treated unequally. Federal funds can be denied totally for violations of the Civil Rights Act. So Harvard, do your duty and do right. And then Alan Garber, the interim president of Harvard, said, "We did. We made this deal. We made this. We're great. We're wonderful. We agreed to the IHRA definition. We are no longer going to allow Jewish students to be treated this way." And then the Trump administration upped the ante and said, "Well, we're not entirely satisfied that you are doing anything, and we're going to continue to enforce, or we're going to block your money if you don't do X, Y, and Z that actually aren't. I mean, they're connected subtly, but not directly."
Right, like
Title
acknowledging admissions data about admissions, oversight
Right.
of certain programs on campus, academic programs on campus, etc.
Right, and then interestingly enough, everyone needs to be tested for being a plagiarist, which I enjoy. I enjoy a good play. I enjoyed the Christine Gay scandal. I'm not sure how that quite fits in here, but in other words, what they did in negotiating with Harvard is Harvard's like, "Okay, we'll try to negotiate with you," and then they're like, "Oh yeah, here are 302 more demands."
Right. They put this is like they let Columbia walk through the body scanner, and they're giving Harvard a strip search. That's what this is. A sort of unnecessary body cavity search.
Right. I'm not going to defend Harvard in any way, shape, or form. But again, what they've done is say you're cut off. And then there are these, again, binding contracts in the form of grants, which are signed legal things that the prior administrations had agreed to, that, again, you're using an emergency power rather than suing Harvard. Like, they're not saying, "We're suing you to cancel these contracts because you are violating Title VI." They're saying, we're doing it first. We're asking questions. You sue us, and we'll answer the questions in court. That's not the right way to do it. I'm not going to defend Harvard, but I'm going to also bring up this other thing that is horrifying me beyond belief. If the amount of money that is flowing from the federal government to Harvard is in excess of $9 billion, what on earth is going on? Numbers are being thrown at us about how much money the federal government is pumping into these higher education institutions,
whose endowments are massive. They basically
but those are their private endowments, right? Harvard has a $52 billion endowment. The federal government has been pumping
untaxed endowment.
Yes. Right. But I'm not even talking about that. American taxpayers are funding giant educational institutions at a level, when you put it all together, that I don't think anybody even had the remotest, foggiest clue been going on.
Well, the argument for that
$9
again,
billion in federal money. Okay, yes.
I'm playing devil's advocate on today's episode, but I think the argument
Good.
is that much of that is very expensive capital investment in medical and scientific research that happens on these campuses that combine private and public money in a way that if you were just trying to do this via federal government labs and via federal government scientists, you would not have the same powerhouse of product.
First of all, that may be true. I don't know. I haven't seen any reporting to suggest that there have been wondrous breakthroughs in research at Harvard that have created da 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 da. Like, I mean, that's one thing. It's like $9 billion is going to Harvard. What are we getting for that $9 billion? They're saying they're doing necessary research, right? Really? Okay. You know what I need from Harvard now is a report on the research that they have done using federal money that have materially changed and benefited the lives of Americans.
Well, they should have been.
I don't know that
you're required to report if you accept federal grant money as an institution. Right. So they should be. There should be available
is a total
to the Trump administration.
Right. But this is where rent seeking and self dealing take place in the federal government all over the place already. We're talking about rent seeking with Trump personally, but this whole world, there is this education industrial government complex that is taking taxpayer money and sending it out the door to these very rich, very wealthy institutions. And I'd like to know, and I think this may be the interesting result of what is going on here. It is time for us to know what we are getting for the money that is going out the door. When I am horrified by the number 9 billion going to Harvard, I mean, I don't know what is, somebody who, is, J.D. Vance's mother's neighbor in Ohio. What does that person think?
But
$9 billion.
Joe, when you say none of us had the foggiest idea about this, it's not like it was a secret. No, it was, it's only the horrible behavior of these administrations and these campuses that made us even that brought the number to light, but it was there the whole time.
But this is where
you're exactly right.
Can I just add to that is that this is actually where, in the progressive era, you did have these crusaders who went up against, both private businesses that were creating harmful products or using child labor, all these other things. And they also attacked corruption in government. So, some of their schemes were very bad, but many of them led to long-term improvements in how we ran our government and how businesses ran as well. So what's interesting to me about Trump is that it's always still kind of pitched as personal terms. He's the populist impulse to demand exactly what you're demanding, John. How are you spending taxpayers' money? Where is this money going? That impulse for sunlight is very good. I think it's healthy. I think this country was long overdue for it. In that sense, I agree with you that much of what he's doing in attacking these elite institutions will be valuable. But he's not doing it because he really cares about corruption. Because as we just discussed earlier, he's happy to engage in corrupt favor trading if it benefits him. And that's where I think that is what worries me long term about how rising generations will look at this particular cultural and political moment. That's the cynicism that I think is very corrosive long term. And there is no one in his administration who is making the moral case for what he's actually doing, because he doesn't really care about the moral or ethical case. He cares about
when it comes to making the moral case, he goes personal, which is where we could get back to the nation of man and not laws, which is he says, they're very mean to me. They don't talk nicely to me. CBS is doing mean stories about my administration. Their license should be revoked, or their merger should go through.
Before we move on from the education, though, can I just say one more thing on the $9 billion? What it reveals is that the universities, their primary mission is not education. These are not educational institutions. These are institutions that have classes. And there's a certain amount of money that goes to teaching the students, right? But the lion's share of that is going to, these other programs and experiments and labs and all sorts of, and again, that stuff may be doing good work. I'm not anti, lab work. I'm just saying, like, the school, is it a school? Is that what Harvard is? Is Columbia a school? Is it about educating kids? Because now a lot of people are saying, well, what the Trump administration is doing is they're just trying to destroy liberal education, liberal higher education in America. But are they? Do we have point to me the education part of the mission of any of these institutions? Because it all looks to me. By the way,
that's very important and gets to Christine's point about the sunlight. Because what is allocated to what, right? What we think of in our fantasy is that kids go to college and they get an education, and therefore colleges are about educating 18 to 22-year-olds and bringing them into the sort of the elites, essentially, or some version of, to work in satisfying jobs that aren't just about working with your hands and all of that. When you read this stuff and you hear it, you start thinking, well, maybe that's like 7 or 8% of what they're actually spending at these schools. And that it's kind of like in reverse what happened when people started getting all freaked out about athletics at schools, when you were suddenly like, how much is the coach of the football team being paid?
And
here at LSU, $5 million a year at a public university is being paid $5 million a year to coach a football team. What does football have to do with the job of educating young people? I mean, it's fun. It's fun for kids to have a team to root for, but $5 million is being paid to the coach of Notre Dame or LSU or Duke or whatever.
To put on the hat, this is even worse than that, because at least with football, you can make a market or a capitalist argument, right? Because the schools get paid for television rights to their games and all sorts of other stuff, maybe some revenue share. But they can bring in revenue if they have the team that everybody wants to watch
so can
at
the
2
labs.
o'clock on Saturday afternoon.
But that's the
labs
joke.
is like, but the labs are bringing in government, like it's all government money. They're not getting more money. NBC to pay them. Right.
Okay.
They're not. In other words, they're not earning.
Right.
And this is not a normal transaction. They're just being handed taxpayer money in gobs and gobs.
Right. Anyway, I think this is we're at an interesting moment here. But every time an elevated argument can be made, Trump can be counted on to turn it into a solipsistic Leopold the Mad King, the Sun King thing, where it's all about him personally. And I guess MAGA likes that, and congratulations to all of them. But that is not the way to make a sustainable argument over time, or even to make sure that the majority of the Supreme Court that you say you're going to listen to isn't watching and reading and going, oh my God, this guy's really slipping through the cracks here of our constitutional order, and we are going to have to do what we can to restrain his craziness, because that is what is starting to peek through.
He's casting a long shadow docket right now for the court. I mean, it's going to continue to grow.
Ooh! Okay, that was an excellent pun. And we're gonna end on that. You got to end on a good pun. So we'll be back tomorrow. For Abe, Christine, and Seth, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.